thanks for everyone who's joining. So today we're going to speak about two issues that I think are top of mind for a lot of employers right now. Definitely the COVID pandemic has made these hot topics in the employment world. So we're going to speak about workplace vaccination policies and remote work policies. So we have our two panelists. We have Karine Dion and Jim Anstey, and they are both lawyers in our labor and employment groups. So they're going to be providing some helpful info, and then we're also going to have opportunities to have questions answered as well. So I believe participants, you should be able to ask questions with the Q&A icon at the bottom. So we're going to go through our two topics and then allow 20 minutes at the end for questions. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to pop them in there, and then we'll try to address them at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Jim, who's going to get us started.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. Great introduction. Just a reminder to everyone that this presentation does not constitute legal advice. What we are trying to do today is to give you some information to go back to your workplaces and to think about if you already have policies in place on these two topics, how can we improve them? So to give you some background information and ideas on how to do that, the things you need to turn your minds to. While you're doing that, you may think that you do need some legal advice at certain points in time. In order to provide advice, obviously, we would need some specific information about your workplace and the issue that you're having. So to start it off, I'm going to talk about the workplace vaccination policies. As you can imagine, employment lawyers have been doing a lot of work in this area over the last 6 months or so. I would say we first started getting inquiries about mandatory vaccine policies last December when the vaccines were first introduced. A lot of employers, at first thought, you can make these mandatory and ask for some advice about how to do that. Initially, most employment lawyers, I would say most of the employment law bar thought that, mandatory vaccination is a pretty strong response and a pretty stringent policy to have. We may not be able to do that, or courts and arbitrators may not allow us to do that. So there would be some significant risk there. Since the vaccines came into the world, and we started getting people vaccinated, including employees, the situation has evolved. It's constantly been evolving. When we first saw the vaccines come in, we thought that they would do their job, and COVID-19 would dwindle and be gone by the summer, perhaps. But here we are in the fourth wave. COVID-19 doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And in fact, we have some variants that are, more contagious and potentially deadlier. So given how things have evolved, I would say most employment lawyers now think that, having mandatory vaccine policies in your workplace, while still risky because we don't know what the courts and arbitrators are going to do, there's probably less risk there now than, let's go back 6 months or so when the vaccines first came out. One of the problems we have here, of course, is we don't know what our courts and arbitrators are going to do when these policies get challenged. And all we can do is look at other similar areas of law, because there's nothing on point, but some other similar areas of law where courts have been, having to balance different rights of employees, obligations of employers. So we looked at the drug and alcohol cases, where employers in, big industry were trying to put in place policies that required, random drug testing, random alcohol testing. We looked in the healthcare sector, of course, because there are some cases about mandatory flu vaccines. In those cases, the arbitrators' decisions were pretty much all over the map, so not too helpful. And in any event, the COVID-19 pandemic is something completely different than a seasonal flu, and we haven't seen anything like this since the Spanish flu. So while there are certainly legal principles to take out of those cases, there's nothing too helpful there. And there's also frustration of contract cases. For example, when a factory burns down, and the employer wants to terminate employees, perhaps, and not pay severance packages. The courts have said that, for anything that's temporary in nature, they're not going to let employers do that. So, out of those areas of law, I'll say, we've been looking at that. And though initially we did see a lot of risk in these policies, that risk profile has changed so that a lot of employers are now putting in place mandatory vaccine policies or strongly encouraging them at least. And, making sure their people in the workplace know what they need to do and what the expectations are. So if we look at the employer and all the risks here, we've got the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which requires obviously employers to do everything to protect their employees in the workplace. This is nothing new to employers. We've been dealing with this for a long time. But of course, COVID-19 is a hazard, and it's something that employers will draw on later when they're trying to defend their policy. We've also got negligence law, and this is not talked about a lot, but if as an employer you're doing something different than other employers in the community, in your industry, I'll say, there's potentially a negligence claim, if you're not following the standard of care. If you look in your industry and you see that other employers are acting a certain way because of perceived risk, there's potentially a risk there if you don't act and put in place a policy. On the employee side, we have employee privacy rights. Of course, we're asking employees to provide personal information about their vaccine status. In their accommodation request, we're asking for information that's usually pretty private and not shared very, very broadly. We've got human rights. Some employees will state, and some employees, in fact, won't be able to take a vaccine for medical reasons. Some potentially might have a religious ground to not take the vaccine and seek an accommodation. And then finally, we have contractual rights. So some employees, if there are policies that are challenged or employers terminate employees, the employees can always say, when I signed my employment contract, it didn't have a clause that said I had to get a vaccine to be able to work here. Therefore, it's really a constructive dismissal, and I'm entitled to a severance package. So employers face risks from really all sides in this situation. Again, in order to make sure everyone's expectations are in check and this issue, which is very important, is well managed, the best thing to do is to have a policy. I believe by now that most employers probably have policies, whether it's verbal or in writing. But I would encourage any employer who doesn't get a policy and make sure it's in writing. So the first part of the policy, I like to call it a preamble. And I think you need a few paragraphs at the outset to describe why we need the policy. They say hindsight is 2020. When these policies, if we get into an issue with an employee or a union and a policy is challenged, it's going to be a long time down the road before someone actually looks at this. So we want to make sure that the judge or arbitrator looking at this policy sees at the outset why we're putting it in place and why we need it. You may say, well, Jim, it's a pandemic, a global pandemic. Everyone knows what's happening, but it's remarkable how people forget things. So at the outset of the policy, I recommend having a few paragraphs about why we need the policy, talking about COVID-19, the fact that it's no longer a transitory issue. It really looks like something that's more permanent. That fact that it's, a very transmissible disease, it's a deadly disease. And then especially, it's important, if you can, tailor it for your workplace in the sense of showing where your vulnerabilities are and why you really need that policy. Obviously, if you work in healthcare, elder care, child care, that's a pretty easy thing to put in your preamble, those vulnerable populations that you service. Also, if you deal with if you have frontline workers who deal with the public, I would say that's a high risk area. And so if you can find some things to say in your preamble about why you need the policy, that's going to help down the road, I think, when you're trying to defend it. So state your policy clearly. What I mean here is, if you are going to enforce a mandatory vaccine policy, state that. If your policy is that you strongly encourage the vaccine, but it's not mandated, then you should also state that. So third, describe the procedure for providing vaccination status. So, I mean, in Ontario, it's pretty easy. We can go to a website and we can download a certificate. I mean, the certificate's going to have a lot of information on it. It's going to have, I mean, although it's one piece of paper, this is personal health information. So it's going to have information on it that we probably don't need. So the type of vaccine received, the lot number of the vaccine. And while it might sound simple, having this additional information and having it there is kind of a liability in the sense if it goes missing or gets stolen, if your mainframe gets hacked, which is happening more and more often, the less information you have, the better. So what I've been talking to some employers about is instead of asking for a copy of their certificate, is to just ask for a view of the certificate on the employee's phone or however you want to do that, and then just make a check mark on a spreadsheet somewhere or however you want to record the data, so that you don't actually have the certificate in your files. So again, the data is personal health information and comes under the Personal Health Information Protection Act. That act requires that you tell the people whose information it is how you're going to collect it, use it, and disclose it. So with respect to how you talk about this in your policy, really it's more to provide a reassurance to your employees that you're only going to collect what's necessary and you're only going to use and disclose it for the purposes of occupational health and safety. I do like to put a proviso in there that you also may need to use and disclose it in response to any legal requirements. For example, if public health changes a policy and requires employers to provide data, we want to make sure we already have that covered off in the policy so you don't have to do anything extra. Provide an overview of the consequences for those who do not respect the policy. So this is one area in particular where different employers are tackling the situation in different ways. Some employers will say outright that if you are not vaccinated, there's a potential to be terminated. Some employers are saying if you're not vaccinated, you can't come into the office, the employers that have that ability. Others are keeping it a little more vague, so they have some discretion over what they do. And I do recommend that, as you word the policy, you keep some control because you're going to get potentially faced with a lot of different kinds of situations. And you may want to respond in a different way and not be, I'll say, handcuffed by your policy. Make sure you allow for accommodation measures. This is really important. One way that employees will challenge a policy or a union will be through the Human Rights Code. And that code requires that we not discriminate against those with disabilities, those with different religions, those with certain family situations, and that we actually accommodate for them. It doesn't mean that you're absolutely going to provide an accommodation, but in your policy, you have to make it clear that you're going to consider a request for accommodation and that especially you're going to comply with the Human Rights Code. Because this is such a risky area, you really should spend some time, making sure that you cover off all those bases. Also in the policies, I would say for most employers I'm working with, the vast majority of employees have been vaccinated. And most employers already know it, but they do know that some employees will not get vaccinated, and some employees may think they have an accommodation request to make. For those employees, it's important that you at least make an effort to get them educated. So if you are familiar with what some of the governments are doing lately, especially here in Ontario, for public employees, if they decide not to get the vaccine, they have to go through an education course. And then there are other measures after that if they're still not vaccinated. As an employer, I'm not sure that's something that you can, a private sector employer, I'm not sure that's something you can force on an employee to get educated. But it does go a long way, perhaps, to put some links in your policy to the Public Health Agency of Canada, Public Health Ontario, Ottawa Public Health. Their websites are full of information about the safety of the vaccines, different studies, and that kind of thing. So having certain links in the policy may actually get some who were hesitant to educate themselves and potentially get vaccinated, if that's your goal, of course. Finally, identify a contact person who's going to field questions and accommodation requests. So it's best to have one point person. I mean, it depends on the size of your organization, but if you're not too big, having one person manage the vaccination policy, one person who accepts requests for accommodation, and one person who asks questions, because it may be that the policy is not clear enough to some employees and they need to really understand what the obligation is or what the expectation is and what the consequences are. So having one person to field all those questions is important, because you don't want an employee who you're about to discipline because they're not vaccinated or suspend to say that they were misinformed by their own manager who wasn't completely clear on what the policy was. So having one person to do all of that would be in your best interest. Similar to how organizations have one point person typically for privacy requests or privacy complaints, or one person who you make complaints to about workplace harassment. So having a one person, that one contact, and identified in your policy is a really good idea. The last thing is the timing of the policy. So when you bring your policy into force, if you haven't already, you're going to need to leave some lag time between the time you introduce it and when it becomes effective, or at least the part that requires vaccination becomes effective. For any employee who wants to comply and they haven't already been vaccinated, if they get their first dose today, it's going to be, I think, at least 4 weeks before they get their second dose, if not longer. And my understanding is that there are fewer clinics around now to actually provide the doses. So you do want to make sure you have some leeway there in terms of when the policy becomes effective. And that's my presentation. We'll have some questions at the end, or time for questions at the end.
All right, so thank you, Jim, for that wonderful presentation. And now we're going to kind of flip to the other side of the coin, which is those who are working remotely. So today we're going to go over what is remote work, go over the pre-pandemic and post-pandemic situation and how to plan for our new reality. We're going to discuss remote work policies and then discuss other considerations for employees as well. The first thing is, what is remote work? So that's all work performed away from the employer's physical premises. It can include anything from working from home, in a coffee shop, or those that are working while on vacation. Okay. In the pre-pandemic situation, it was actually very rare to have employers permit remote work. And even where it was necessary as an accommodation measure, you still found that businesses were hesitant and reluctant to agree to it. There seems to be this fear that employees who work remotely didn't work as hard or weren't as engaged as those that were working in the physical office. And FaceTime was a thing that was generally quite important to employers before the pandemic. For those businesses that allowed flexible remote work policy, they were viewed a little more skeptically by other businesses that didn't. Okay. And now in March 2020, most businesses were ordered to shut down, with the exception of those that could function with employees working remotely. So businesses sent employees home with whatever technology they could at the time to help keep the work going. And although it was a bit difficult at the beginning, workplaces found new ways of doing business and new ways for colleagues to interact with each other using platforms such as Zoom, Teams. Our presentation today might have otherwise been in person, but it is now virtual, as an example. Okay. And for those businesses that were able to continue working remotely, they actually saw increased productivity. I know in all of the articles that I read, they said it was either stable, the same, or better. And businesses also realized that there could be quite a few cost savings from having employees work remotely, rent being probably the biggest one of them. And now we have to go into post-pandemic planning. Currently, employees are still generally encouraged to work remotely where possible, even though some have been encouraged to return to the workplace. That's not always going to be the case. You're going to have employers who want their employees back in the office. So what do we do with that? Over the pandemic, there has been a shift in employees' view of their workday. Employees are expecting to be able to have some flexibility going forward and the ability to work from home at least some of the time. If an employer is unwilling to allow that, even though they could otherwise allow it, there might be some issues with retaining good talent, and employees might try to find a job elsewhere where they could continue to work remotely. That said, there are also legal consequences that have to be considered on how employers communicate or fail to communicate their expectations on remote work to their employees. Okay. So for example, the longer a practice is in place, the more employees can claim that that practice forms part of their terms and conditions of employment. So that begs the question, is the ability to work remotely a fundamental term of an employee's employment contract? So by example, if you had someone that started working for a company during the pandemic, they were probably working remotely from day one. And then they might have an argument to say, well, that's part of my term and condition of employment. I've always worked remotely. I should be able to continue working remotely. But what if that's not what the employer wants? And that's where the remote work policy comes into play. So there are 12 main considerations for drafting a remote work policy. The first is the employer's philosophy. So similar to the preamble that Jim discussed for the vaccination policy, you want a similar kind of preamble for the remote work policy that also talks about the need for it. Does the employer allow it? And if so, under what circumstances? Kind of just setting the stage for why it exists in the first place. The second one is whether it's a right or a privilege. So there are some workplaces that have gone fully virtual since the pandemic hit, and they are going to remain fully virtual. But for the other workplaces, the policy should probably specify that it's going to be a privilege to work remotely and not a right, just to maintain that flexibility should you need employees to return to the office, or for some reason when you're managing their productivity, you recognize that they're not working as hard and you do want them to return to the office to make sure that you can kind of keep an eye on them a bit more. And that goes into the third consideration for the policy, which is managing productivity. The policy should confirm how an employer will manage the employee's productivity, since they won't be seeing them as often. So for example, you might want to do a weekly check-in with the supervisor and all the employees that report to them. Employees might need to account for their time, and the policy should also specify that employers must continue to do as they would have done, just as though they were in the office. So if they need to attend a medical appointment, they should tell their supervisor when they're going to be out of the office, and they should record that properly in the internal system, however that might be recorded. You need to manage overtime. So employers are still going to be liable to pay those employers who are entitled to overtime pay the proper overtime amounts, and there needs to be a way to track that overtime. Obviously, if someone's working remotely, it's a lot harder to track what is regular hours and overtime hours. So the policy might want to be a little more specific and want to focus on the employee having to get prior approval prior to working overtime, in lieu of just having an employee claim all these hours during the week. And the policy should also specify how the hours are going to be tracked in the system, it's overtime hours. Response time. So if someone was in the office and got an email and a phone call, how long would it take that person to respond? Technically, it should probably take the same amount of time to respond if you're working remotely as well. So the policy might want to specify that the response time expectation is the same as though they were working in the office. So if it's within 12 hours, within 24 hours, you might want to specify that, or just relate it back to regular practice. And employers want to make sure that employees are going to be just as responsive, even though they're working remotely, than if they were in the office. Expectations for virtual meetings and dress code. So today, I'm obviously dressed professionally because I'm doing a webinar today. Does that mean that I have to dress this way every day if I'm not going to be in front of a camera? Maybe not. And the policy should address that. So we've also heard stories of people who are maybe smoking or eating, doing other things while on a virtual meeting that really wouldn't have been happening if they were in person. So the policy should specify what behaviors are acceptable. A lot of people have not been turning on their camera during meetings, and I'm hearing more and more from clients and other colleagues that it's now mandated that your camera has to be on when you're on a virtual meeting to make sure that you're engaged. And look business appropriate when you are doing something on camera. So that should also be stated in the policy. Availability to attend in person. So sometimes you might want your employees to be in person. You might want to do a monthly group meeting, for example, to make sure that the employees are staying engaged, or you might have an important event where people need to attend in person. So things like that need to be addressed in the policy. The ability to call employees back, with some notice, of course, but the ability to at least call them back, even if they're working remotely full-time. Protection of employers' confidential information. So there might be minimum protection requirements for those working remotely that should be included in the policy. For example, if there's a lot of confidential information that someone's dealing with and they have a full household, spouse and children, you might want to say, well, at the end of the day, you do have to lock away this information in a place with a key. It's really confidential. Or if you want them to have a certain length of password for the computer, for the internet, you can't really ensure the privacy as easily of the confidential information as though they were working from the office. So you do want to specify in the policy what requirements they have to hit in terms of protecting that confidential information. And for those employers who have very confidential information, you might not even want the employee to bring it home with them. So if that's the case, that should also be stated in the policy. Use of employers' devices and networks. So the policy might want to specify that you cannot work off of a personal computer because the employer, you probably want to ensure appropriate level of software and programs installed on the computer. And it's easier to keep track of that if the employees are using a work-provided computer. The policy should also specify that it's on the employee to protect that workplace computer or other workplace items from theft and damage. And that regardless of the fact that the employer is letting you use it, it does remain the employer's property. Next is high-speed internet requirements. So some remote workers are living in rural areas where the internet access is not as great. So you would want to put in the policy if there's a requirement of having a certain minimum level of internet, such as high-speed internet or whatever might be available in that region, failing which perhaps that employer should not be able to work remotely if they really can't access the systems and do work properly. In what province or country will the remote work take place? So different laws apply for those working in different provinces and in different countries. So the policy should set limitations on where an employee can work to make sure that as an employer, you can keep track of what laws will apply to them. And then similar to the vaccination policy, the entire remote work policy is also subject to the Human Rights Code. The policy must account for those who need to work remotely versus those who simply want to, and how to accommodate people's requests for the ability to work remotely. So there are other considerations that I didn't put specifically in the requirement for the policy itself, but you still want to keep in mind as an employer. That's insurance coverage. Employers can be liable for things that happen to their employees, even though they're working off employer premises. So it's important for employers to understand their own policies and how they apply to those remote workers. Jurisdiction, so I already spoke about understanding and maybe setting limitations on where your employees are working, at least within which province. But there should also be a requirement to tell your employer if you're changing locations. So maybe you were living in Ontario, working from Ontario, and then you bought a house in Quebec. So you would want the policy to specify that, hey, if you change jurisdictions, you're going to have to let us know, because things might be different. Maybe you won't be allowed to work remotely anymore because we don't want Quebec laws to apply, for example. And then employment contracts. So it's important to remember that policies don't alter or replace the terms of existing contracts. So you want to make sure that when drafting policies or drafting any new employment contracts, that you keep in mind the other. And those are all the items that I wanted to go over today for the remote work.
Thanks, Karine. All righty, so thank you both for that. So we have a couple questions that we have a good amount of time to cover. So one of the questions we got was, can you kindly address the question of creed? So that was asked when you were speaking about accommodations to getting the vaccine, Jim. So I guess religious accommodations and how to handle those requests for vaccine within vaccine policies.
To be fair, I'm not getting a lot of inquiries on this subject. I do know that the Human Rights Commission, which is different than the tribunal makes decisions. The commission is more of an advocacy educational group, but what they produce is often highly regarded. The commission has put out a paper on how to accommodate during COVID, and interestingly, at the end of that document, they do state that, you know, a single person's beliefs will not qualify for religious exemption. So if you have a religion of with one follower and you're it's not going to fly. Some employers have asked for proof from the leader of the religion or a pastor or some leader like that to specify you know, that it is a tenet of the religion, and that you know, on that basis the employee shouldn't have to be vaccinated. I'm seeing very little of this. In fact, when the issues do come up, they do seem to resolve themselves.
Great, thank you. So Karine, we have one for you. So what's the kind of protocol if an employee who's working from home, working remotely, wants some kind of ergonomic accommodation, like, you know, what if does the employer have to cover that cost? If they do, what's the difference between that at home or in an office?
Okay, so if someone were working in the office and for some reason they didn't have an ergonomic setup, it would typically be on the employer to help set that up for them. Now, with everyone working from home, you might not have a proper office. An employer might be working off a dining room table with a bad chair, for example. It might request to get, you know, a more ergonomic setup for themselves. Now, if it's just them choosing to work remotely and them asking for it without the actual need for it, they just feel like it would be better for them, then the employer is probably not going to be on the hook for it if it's the employee's choice. If there's a medical certificate that says the employer actually doesn't require certain, you know, a certain type of chair or a certain setup, then you fall within the parameters of the Human Rights Code. And there's probably a higher likelihood that you do have to pay for that accommodation, because if they were working in the office, they would likely need something done to that office space as well. Now, if it's obviously too much, or if you can ask, you know, instead of us outfitting your entire home office with something that works for you, we already have that for you in the office. So there's also the debate, do you just ask them to return to the office, to something that's already properly set up for them? But it's everything based on accommodation and disability is a very unique case-by-case analysis. So you do need to find out more information about what is required for them. And we'll need to accommodate them if it's based on a human rights ground, and if it's based on, you know, personal requirements, or if someone wanting something specific, then there's no requirement to accommodate.
All right, we have a couple more questions coming through. So someone has asked, should employers and unions work at getting work from home language added into the collective agreements? I guess that would be for you, Karine.
Yeah, sorry. I was just reading my question myself. I mean, collective agreements are only up for renewal every few years generally. So if it's going to be something that's ongoing, I say, why not get something in there? It's easier to point to something in a collective agreement to address the workplace parties than it would be to have simply a policy in place and to avoid any arbitrations and things like that. I say, yes, have that in there once the renewal is up to address the workplace going forward, because this is probably going to be ongoing. I don't really see remote work or flexible work going away forever. That said, there are some workplaces where that's just not going to make sense. If you do need the employees in the office and there's no possibility of everyone working remotely, it might not make sense to put it in the agreement. But if it does, I would certainly have it in there, because that's what's going to govern the parties.
Thanks. Okay, we have another question about vaccination policies. This attendee says all our employees, so 25 employees, are fully vaccinated. For future hires, can we make proof of vaccination mandatory for applicants in order to be considered for the position?
I'd say generally yes. Back in my presentation, I talked about the fact that there's a potential risk from employees. If you suspend them or you terminate them within the package, that they can allege a constructive dismissal. Which is that a clause requiring vaccine was not in my contract. So I think putting one in and saying that that's a condition of employment is something you can do along with other things. I mean, it's for occupational health and safety, so there's a legitimate reason. The thing to be careful of, though, is you still have an obligation under the Human Rights Code to accommodate. So if you do have a candidate who can't get a vaccine and it's based on a protected ground under the code, you still have to accommodate that applicant and introduce them into the workplace if they would otherwise be the successful candidate. So just be careful about that.
Alrighty. So another question we have about vaccine policies. So how would one protect employees' health information if it's obvious they have been banned from the office or not allowed to come in? Other employees will know and suspect that that's the reason why. It has to do with their vaccine status. So how would you navigate that?
Some employers are going to have that issue. Some workplaces will have that issue. I think employers are going to have to show they're doing the best that they can to protect that personal health information. Certainly, if you're a big employer and have different departments, employees in other departments may have no idea which employees have been banned from the office and are mandated to work from home. So making sure that stays, within that group can go a long way in case there's a complaint, right? And we have the Privacy Commissioner looking at what you're doing with the employees' vaccination information. If we can show we do have measures in place, we've actually turned our minds to this. We're storing it properly, and we're only those who need to know actually know. But to get back to the question, certainly other employees are going to know if you treat that employee differently, like ban them from the office or make them sit in a different section of the office, for example. That's bound to happen. But I think as long as we can show we're doing the best we can in the circumstances and keeping the information as guarded and only letting those who need to know about it will help out if it's ever challenged, if there's a complaint made.
And then another question kind of related to that, what software should we use to handle vaccine data?
I'm a lawyer, not an IT professional, and every office has their own setup in terms of network software and all that stuff. My recommendation is talk to your IT expert, your IT professional that's providing you, whether it's an in-house employee or whether you might want to go outside to to a third party. Let them know that you're going to be storing some very confidential, sensitive information. I bet lots of them are already working on this and have some good advice to provide. I can't tell you exactly which software to use. The Information and Privacy Commissioner's website as well does have a lot of tips and guides on storing and securing personal health information. I know she does recommend that it be encrypted and passwords and that kind of thing, but the best place to be covered would be to make sure you get the best advice from an IT professional.
Okay, we got a couple for you, Karine. So what are the main considerations for employees who have been working from home throughout the pandemic and now want to work in a different province or country and continue with the same employer?
Okay, so I've actually seen this in some of my clients that, for those federally regulated, it's fine to move between provinces, not a big deal. I saw one completely move out east. And other than the time shift and making sure that they're still available during the core business hours, it wasn't a big deal. But for many employers who are provincially regulated, this could pose a problem. So the first thing that you need to understand is what employment standards legislation would apply if they want to go work in that other province or possibly country. So at that point, we're not dealing with Ontario law anymore. We're either dealing with another province or not even in Canada. So you might want to, if you really want to retain this employee, speak to a local council in that region or someone who is well versed in that province's laws to understand what implications could arise from that perspective. There's also health and safety considerations. So as Jim said, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, an employer does have to provide a healthy and safe working environment for its employees, but that also includes the employee's home office. So if you're moving to a different country or a different province, your home office might look very different from what we typically see day to day, and you still want to make sure that the setup for the employee is going to be a healthy one. I know some employers have gone so far as asking to see the setup virtually, during a call like this, to make sure they could see what it looks like, because they're going to be on the hook for that employee's health and safety, regardless of where they are. And for those employers who sign on to WSIB coverage, the policies do change depending on where the worker is located. So make sure that if you sign on to WSIB, that you understand what policies would apply and how they would apply, and if you need to account for differences with that one worker. Human rights obligations continue to exist for those who are working remotely. As I said, you still have to consider accommodation requests. So just don't forget about those, regardless of where they're located. Confidentiality, data protection, and protocols are going to probably become even more important if someone is not close to the physical office in any respect. So you want to make sure that they are working far away, that you have that good software and you have good IT support and help, and that the computer and the confidential information does remain confidential and protected. And then payroll and tax considerations. So some foreign jurisdictions actually make claim taxes or social security contributions against the employer that works in their jurisdiction. So do make sure you understand what would be required of you as an employer before you allow someone to work in that foreign jurisdiction.
Oh, sorry, perfect. Okay, we have another question coming through the chat. So if your work from home policy stipulates that you can only work from home if your residence is in Ontario, are you discriminating against employees who are living in another province? And the example here is Ottawa versus Gatineau.
Well, I don't believe that the Human Rights Code accounts for where someone lives. So from that perspective, not directly, it's not discriminating against. And I can understand why there is a difference, only because Quebec law would likely be deemed to apply in that situation, which is quite different from Ontario law. So if the employer is simply in Ontario and you were no longer doing any work in Ontario, a different law would apply to you. So I can see why an employer might require this, only because they want to make sure they understand the laws and that they can apply them properly to all of its employees. I would say no. I mean, there's always, if for some reason you have to work in Gatineau for accommodation measures, your family situation, again, it's a case-by-case analysis, but a policy stipulating that generally speaking, you have to work in Ontario, I would say no.
Okay. A little bit more time, so we have a couple more. So a question for Jim. So Jim, if other companies in my industry are allowing remote work and we, demand that employees come back to the office, is that a risk to the business? Is there any kind of liability issue there?
Yeah. So this goes back to the issue about negligence law, and it's not talked about a lot, but if in the community, if in your industry, I'll say in your industry, you know, employers are generally still letting their employees work remotely, and you take a different stance, right? So the community consensus is these employees can work remotely. That's the safest thing, and we'll keep doing that. But your business decides to make employees come into the office. There is a risk to that. Public health agencies are still saying, you know, for distance, you know, to keep distance, one of the best ways is to let employees who can work remotely do that. I know it's starting to change, but I think there's an argument to be made for an employee who is forced to come into the office when in their industry that's not what's happening, and they somehow get sick or they bring the virus home to a vulnerable person that lives with them, for example. So I'm just flagging it as a potential risk. It's really not something that's on a lot of lawyers' radar or employers' radar, but something just to keep in mind.
Okay, we have one more for you, Jim, and this one has to do with travel and quarantining. So our business typically requires a lot of travel, although we've been doing everything remotely until now. Travel requirements are starting to come back. So who is responsible for costs associated with the quarantine if an employee gets sick while traveling?
If travel is a part of your workplace and the employees, the employees traveling because they're on business, and the employee gets sick, I would say, it's something that's outside of the employee's control. And because they're on business, and assuming they're acting reasonably as well, right? Assuming the employees are following the public health measures in the place they are, I think the employer is going to be on the hook for costs associated with, extended stays, quarantining, that sort of thing. I would say in this new reality we're in, it's a new risk of doing business if you're going to send your employees to other jurisdictions and have them traveling during a pandemic.
All right, thanks, Jim. Okay, so I think that's all the questions we had. If anyone else has any for the chat, definitely try to get that in now. But I think we covered a lot of good information. So thanks so much, Jim and Karine, obviously, for your time and your information. For all the attendees, just a heads up, we recorded this and we'll be posting the recording as well, and we'll send that link to all the attendees and registrants. So if you were late and you didn't catch the first part, then you'll be able to watch that, the recording of it. And I'd also recommend, our website, nelliganlaw.ca, has lots of blogs and resources about lots of these topical issues and questions. So definitely check out our website. Lots of free information on there, and also has all our contact information for our team. So yeah, I think that's it. I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think we can probably wrap it up now.
Thank you, Hannah.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody. Bye.